Joining us today is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Hello, Daniel. Hello, Sophia.
We are following unconfirmed reports that an energy ceasefire may have begun on Thursday, January 29th. Russian military bloggers say Russian forces were ordered to halt strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure across whole Ukraine. The report follows a Financial Times story published on January 22nd, saying the US and Ukraine discussed proposing a limited ceasefire in which Russia would stop attacking energy infrastructure in Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine halting strikes on Russian refineries and shadow fleet tankers. If Russian dictator Vladimir Putin agreed to this, why would he do so?
Well, I think I have to admit to you, Daniel and Sophia, what I said on Monday. And I said that coming out of last weekend's talks in Abu Dhabi, I didn't have enough information to know exactly where we were, both with the talks and also with the possibility of a ceasefire. And I have to say that since Monday, what we've gotten is a confusion of different claims and reports. So I'll answer your question, Daniel, if I could, and put it in a wider context. On the immediate issue of whether we have an energy ceasefire, at least one that lasts through this weekend, while you have the second set of talks in Abu Dhabi, we'll find out tonight, to be honest with you. You know, if the Russians do not attack tonight, try to hit energy infrastructure, other civilian sites, then maybe they have agreed, because, you know, on a day, night by night basis, they've been firing the missiles, firing the drones, quite often hundreds of munitions, trying to freeze you out, trying to deny you electricity as well as heating. But at this point, what we have are claims from some Ukrainian military personnel and Russian military bloggers, effectively military observers, that say, yes, the ceasefire has been agreed from 7 a.m. Kyiv time, but the Kremlin has refused to confirm this, effectively declined to comment. We don't have any official statement yet from the Zelensky government, nor do we have anything from the Americans as the would-be brokers of this. So I honestly don't know about that ceasefire. But let me put this in the wider context. What has happened in the past 48 hours is a series of very concerning statements that the talks themselves are chaotic, that they are not being handled in a professional manner, especially by the U.S. envoys. Now, on the surface, out of last weekend, the Zelensky government said positive, constructive talks. The Kremlin, of course, said, you know, these talks went well, even though they maintained their maximum demands. They kept on demanding the surrender of Ukrainian territory. And I kept wondering how could that be the case, you know, that everybody's saying the talks are positive when we don't have a resolution in terms of what is happening with the territory. Well, I think we got a clue from the Financial Times. Now, they're citing 8 people close to the discussions. They do not say whether they're Ukrainian, Russian, or U.S. But I know that a couple of them are Americans. Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer, and Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, are returning to the ultimatum that they gave Ukraine at the end of October. Now, remember, that ultimatum was worked out with the Kremlin. It was worked out with Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's top financial advisor. And that ultimatum was pushed back. In other words, Ukraine said, no, we're not going to surrender all of the Donetsk region in the east of the country. We're not going to go without security guarantees. And Ukraine and Europe were able to push back that demand until we got to these talks last weekend. What Witkoff and Kushner are saying, according to these 8 sources, is Ukraine, you give up all of Donetsk. That demand they made in late October, that demand that Steve Witkoff made in front of Vladimir Zelensky when he last saw Donald Trump. You give up all of the Donetsk region, and then we'll give you security guarantees. So you have this sweetener. Oh, it's not Ukraine surrendering territory. They supposedly get these security guarantees. But these security guarantees are quite vague that are being put out by the Americans. They're not as detailed as even what we've heard in the Ukraine-Europe proposals, that the U.S. will lead the aerial dimension of the security guarantees. And Ukraine, my friends in Ukraine, and you'll know some of these people are coming back and saying, look, in the 1990s, we were given the Budapest Memorandum that was supposedly for our security. What good has that been? We want specifics. Out of the Minsk agreements after Russia seized territory in Crimea in 2014 and was trying to split off eastern Ukraine, where were the specifics in what Ukraine would get in terms of security if it made concessions? That's point 1. If you don't mind me continuing. Point 2. It is now being reported this morning in the Kyiv Independent that Steve Witkoff briefed journalists about how the talks were going and that he showed a disturbing, some of their sources said shocking, lack of knowledge of what is happening. According to the journalists who were on the call, Witkoff did not even know the position of Kirill Budanov, who is now Vladimir Zelensky's chief of staff and very important figure in the Ukraine discussion of where it is in the negotiations. Kirill Budanov also was former head of military intelligence. Steve Witkoff said, oh, he's the vice president. Ukraine doesn't have a vice president. Witkoff also, when he was asked about did Donald Trump want to get an end to the Russian invasion before the 4th anniversary of the full-scale attack, which is on February 24th, said, oh, I don't know the date. I don't know that date. What, you don't know the date? You are mediating the talks and you don't know when the invasion started? Third, and then I'll pause for breath. The Wall Street Journal has a lengthy article today which talks about 3 ways that this might end. That this might end because we get a resolution that stops the Russian invasion. We get an agreement, or Ukraine has to surrender, or Russia has to give up on its invasion. That's not the important part of the article. The important part's in the first few paragraphs where it puts out a scenario which says Ukraine gives up the Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, then Ukraine will get security guarantees, and then everyone will make money. That is probably a briefing to the Wall Street Journal, if not from Witkoff and Kushner, from those people in the delegation. That puts it right on the table. Ukraine gives up Donetsk. Oh, good, you've given it up. You've given up. Look, Ukraine, you can have these security guarantees, and look, everybody's going to get rich off of this. Rare earth minerals, other investment deals, etc. And I just want to remind folks, I want to take you all the way back to last April, when the Kremlin was on a bit of the back foot because Ukraine and Europe had pushed back against the threat that America would cut off all assistance. They had a psychological study of Steve Witkoff. They wanted Witkoff as the U.S. envoy. They did not want Keith Kellogg, who was supposed to be the envoy to Ukraine and Russia. They got Witkoff. When they got Witkoff as the envoy, the first thing they did is that Kirill Dmitriev, a finance guy, an investment guy, he got a hold of Witkoff. He gave him great tours of St. Petersburg and Moscow, and he said, we can have great economic projects together. Jared Kushner is all about economic projects. If you've seen what happened in Gaza, if you see what happens in the Gulf and if you see what happens here. So I'm going to put all of this together. I don't know about an energy ceasefire. I don't know if that will happen because I don't know who's putting that information out. But what I do know from putting everything else together is that you have unqualified U.S. envoys who are trying to force Ukraine to give up territory under the guise that this will provide a stable settlement because everybody can get rich. And that is very, very dangerous, first and foremost, for people in Ukraine.
Let's also get back to this interesting topic of possible energy ceasefire. Does the Kremlin test a compromise by agreeing to ceasefire or by spreading such information among Russian pro-war, pro-Kremlin military bloggers because they're close to the Kremlin?
I'm going to be honest with you. I think the idea of the energy ceasefire, because you mentioned quite rightly that it came out last Thursday before the first round of the talks, and it was in the Financial Times, that Ukraine and the U.S. had put this to the Russians. I think this is coming from the Americans. I think the Americans are coming out and saying, look, we might get an energy ceasefire, and are hoping the Kremlin will agree to it. Now, the Kremlin might agree to it, but I think the Kremlin is agreeing to it as a way to keep the Americans sweet, right? Everything that Russia is focused on right now, not everything. One of the things that Russians are focused on right now is they want Donetsk. That for them is a minimum. And that's why these talks will not work. I can tell you this right now. If they think they can get Donetsk by pausing attacks for a few days, I think they'll do it, right? But this is why I'm emphasizing to you that this story, the energy ceasefire, is part of a much wider story here at a very, very sensitive point in the negotiations. Let me add one other complication, which is confusing. Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, was in a congressional hearing on Wednesday. And he talked about a lot of topics. He talked about Venezuela, he talked about Greenland, but when it got to Ukraine and Russia, he said, well, Witkoff and Kushner will not be in Abu Dhabi on Sunday. They won't be there at the second round of talks. He then later said, oh, there will be some U.S. officials there, but he didn't explain who would be there, right? So what exactly are these talks that are going to be in the second round? Are the Americans attempting to get direct Ukraine-Russia talks? Are they providing lower-level mediators? What exactly is going on here? The way I read that Rubio statement here is, and the way that I read the Kremlin statement this morning, that the format of the talks on Sunday has not yet been determined, is that it is uncertain if these talks are going ahead on Sunday. Certainly, it's not clear in what format they're proceeding. So getting an energy ceasefire buys you a bit of time, right, to think about where the next steps are. It gets a bit of time for the Kremlin because it takes pressure off of them from the Americans. It gets a bit of time for Ukraine, to be honest with you, because you can finally get a bit of sleep at night and possibly come out of this energy crisis. And it gets a bit of time for the Americans to figure out what the hell is going on. Because I'm sorry, I'm a little bit passionate about this. I'm going to come back to a fundamental. You're talking about the most serious invasion in Europe possibly since 1945. We had a report this week, and I think it's a pretty good report, that in terms of military casualties, and that is killed, wounded, captured, on both sides, we're talking at about 1.8 million, more than 2/3 of which is on the Russian side. We're talking about tens of thousands of civilian casualties, and the U.S. it does not have diplomats that are trying to get a settlement here. It does not have people who are trained in mediation and negotiation who are involved here. It has a real estate developer and the president's son-in-law. And that is not a recipe for how you try to end this invasion. It is absolutely not, especially when the Kremlin knows how they can manipulate a real estate developer and the president's son-in-law.
I just want to follow up on this topic on Sunday's negotiations. Indeed, according to Marco Rubio, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are not planning to attend this set of peace talks. And for me, I'm curious actually how effective can this meeting be without Witkoff and Kushner, also taking into account, as you said, that Witkoff is not very well prepared for resolving Russian war against Ukraine? And why did Americans and particularly these two persons decide to step back?
I don't know, Sophia, right? I don't know what the heck is going on in Washington because, look, it's not, I don't think Witkoff and Kushner are good at trying to supposedly mediate this. But what does that mean if they say, oh, they're not going to be there? I mean, you know this, you can answer this for me. Do you expect Ukrainian officials to sit down at a table with the Russians with no one else there, right? No, I don't think that's going to happen. Okay, so Witkoff and Kushner are not there. Marco Rubio did not indicate he would be there. So who are the Americans who are there, right? And again, I just want to remind you why this is so worrying. Because remember that in the past, the Americans have not prepared very well for these kinds of things. So for example, when Steve Witkoff went to the Kremlin to see Vladimir Putin, you know the infamous occasion when not only had he not prepared for what happened, he didn't have another American official with him, not even an interpreter. The Kremlin provided the interpreter. So I get the impression from what Rubio said that what Witkoff did immediately after round one of the talks, and you know this, is everything's going great. They had a wonderful lunch together and they had such a wonderful time. And we think that President Putin and President Zelensky are going to meet very, very soon. We think this is all coming about. And the Russians came back and said, well, no, I mean, we will meet President Zelensky, but it has to be in Moscow. And then a Ukrainian official said, oh, well, Steve Witkoff, he likes even a basic show of civility, people being nice to each other, and he thinks this is substantial progress in the talks. I don't think they proceeded very far last weekend. And because I don't think they proceeded very far last weekend, I think people in the Trump administration thought, oops, we might embarrass ourselves if we go back this weekend and it doesn't work. And so that's why the confusion here is who would be the Americans who were there, et cetera. And that's why I said, I don't like to make predictions, but it would not surprise me if these talks did not come off on Sunday, that they don't show up in Abu Dhabi.